Hi, this is Steph Mishuk with KillerSites.com and KillerPHP.com. And in this podcast, we're going to discuss some database theory. When I'm talking about databases or a database, I'm talking about something like MySQL. So I assume that many of you who are listening to this are interested in learning about database-driven websites. The reason I mention MySQL as the database because it's probably the most used database out there today. And the reason it's used most often is probably because it's free. And second of all, it's very, very powerful. Fortunately for us PHP nerds, MySQL and PHP have a long history that goes back to the very infancies of both of these free software products. And as a result, they've both sort of developed hand in hand over the years. And there is a tight connection between PHP and MySQL. As such, it's very, very easy to work with MySQL and PHP together. But before we can get into discussing how to use PHP and MySQL in combination with each other, we need to first discuss what exactly a database like MySQL is. In a nutshell, a database like MySQL is a virtual cabinet, a virtual file folder, if you will, where you store records about just about anything you want. Records could be things like shopping cart content or online stores like Amazon, for instance, stores all their books and CDs and so forth that they sell in big databases. There are many different types of databases out there, and the most popular being a relational database. Now, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what a relational database is because MySQL happens to be one. I'm not going to get into the dirty details, so don't worry about it. But you should just know at least the basics. Essentially, a relational database stores its data, so stores the information that it's holding in a series of virtual tables. They literally look like spreadsheets, if you will, like you'd see in Excel or something. And the table has a bunch of rows and a bunch of columns, and each of these rows represents a different item that the database is storing. So a relational database stores its information in tables. That's number one. Number two, it organizes its information in tables by creating what they call relationships between different pieces of information in different tables. So for instance, in a particular database, you might have a database called My Products, where you have a list of all your products. And you would have one table, one virtual container, which would contain all the general information about your products, the product ID, the product name, product description, and so forth. Then you might have another table in this same database that gives a little bit more information about the products. For instance, you might list multiple prices. So let's say you have a wholesale price, you have a retail price, and you have a volume discount price. So you might have another table called product prices in the same database. So these two different tables, these two different virtual containers do have records that relate to each other, in that the product table, where you have your sort of your master list of all your products, is related to the product prices table because the product prices table actually contains pricing information about the products. You notice I use the word relationship. There's a relationship between the product price table or virtual container and the product virtual container. And you establish relationships in a relational database like MySQL so that you can more easily track the information. So again, point number one is that in a relational database, you track your information in tables, in these virtual containers that sort of visually they would look like Excel spreadsheets. And number two, you help organize this information in your tables by creating relationships between different pieces of information that are being stored in different tables. Now, the first question that comes to my mind is, why would you store information, many different virtual containers, into many different tables? Why not store all the information in one table? It's a little complex to discuss in a podcast. It's something you have to see, and we'll demonstrate actually in the videos. But just understand that by creating multiple tables inside of a database to track different information that is related to each other, like products and their prices and their product prices, for instance, it creates for a more efficient database structure. And again, once we get into the details of the MySQL database and relational databases in general, you're going to learn a couple of these rules. Just for now, understand that you do create multiple tables in a database, and you create relationships. I mentioned earlier that there are several different types of databases out there, the most popular being the relational database, and we just discussed why it's called a relational database. MySQL is the most popular database used today, and it's actually very much tightly coupled with PHP, as I mentioned earlier. So that's the type of database we're going to concentrate on. That said, I just want to mention a couple different types of databases out there besides the relational database. The first thing that pops into my mind is the object database. And this is a more advanced or more recent rather type of database where all the information is stored in a series of virtual objects. It's different from tables because the tables, when you store your objects, when you store your data in tables, you may break up information about a particular item that you're storing in your database amongst many different tables. Whereas in an object database, all the information stored about a particular item, or in other words, a particular record, are all stored in one discrete object. Besides that, the geek or programmatic architecture surrounding a relational database versus an object database are quite different. Object databases are very recent in relationship to relational databases, meaning relational databases have been around for much, much longer, 30 years or so, I think, at this point, whereas object databases are a much newer technology, at least in concept. And the reason people decide to come up with object databases is because of object-oriented languages. I don't want to go down this path too much because it's just going to confuse everybody, and it's really not too important. But understand there are relational databases, which is something like MySQL or SQL Server, which is Microsoft's database server, and then even Access, and there's a whole bunch of other ones. Oracle, for instance, is a relational database. And then you have object databases out there, which are not nearly as popular, but they're growing. They're growing quite a bit. And it's just another way, another style, if you will, storing data. So which one is better than the other? It really depends who you're talking to. There are arguments for both, and it really depends on what you're doing. For me, though, since PHP is so tightly coupled, works so well with MySQL, I don't see any other reason to use any other type of database. Besides the fact that PHP works so well with MySQL, MySQL comes included with even the most basic of hosting packages. So it really makes sense that you learn how to use that particular database server. The last type of database that I want to discuss is something called a flat file system. And it's actually the most simple form of database, and it's probably the original form. And essentially, it's just storing your data in simple text files right onto the server, and that's pretty much it. And you could do this with just about any programming language, and you could do it with PHP using PHP's file creating and editing capabilities. With PHP, you can of course create files, text files, and write information to them, and read the information from the files and update the information. So you could do this in PHP, create what they call a flat file system. Flat files have certain advantages, but overall very primitive. And today, you're much better off using something like MySQL, a relational database, or an object database. Flat file systems are really just something that you may use in a very simple, very simple application. Maybe something like a guest book or something like that. But even then, you might as well just use MySQL because it gives you all kinds of extra capabilities and tools that you wouldn't have with a flat file system. So to recap, we've looked over the three, probably the most prominent types of databases out there: the relational database, the object database, and the flat file system. We've learned that MySQL is a relational database, and we've also learned that the most prominent or the most common type of database out there are relational databases. With that all said, it only makes sense that we concentrate on relational database work in theory. And so the next set of videos and podcasts are all going to be concerned with that type of database, and specifically MySQL, since it works very well with PHP.